Hello, literacy leaders and champions. Welcome to Literacy Talks. We're so excited to welcome you to this podcast series from Reading Horizons, dedicated to exploring the ideas, trends, insights, and practical issues that will help us all improve our professional practice in teaching reading. Our series host is Stacy Hurst, professor at Southern Utah University and chief academic officer at Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Joining Stacy are Donnell Pons, a recognized expert in literacy and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, a Utah-based elementary classroom teacher. Recently, our three podcast hosts attended the Plain Talk Conference in New Orleans, and they're excited to share all they learned in this discussion led by Lindsay Kemeny. Let's get started.
Welcome to another episode of Literacy Talks. I am Stacy Hurst, and I'm joined today by the lovely people I'm joined with every week, Donnell Pons and Lindsay Kemeny. We have some exciting things to talk about today. And Lindsay, it was your turn to choose the topic. So I will just turn the time over to you.
It was easy to choose the topic this week because we just got back from New Orleans last week at the Plain Talk Conference. And if you haven't heard of this conference, it's kind of like the Woodstock of literacy conferences. It's full of experts, people in the field sharing all kinds of things related to the science of reading. So it was an amazing few days together. Let's just start by sharing some overall observations of the conference. It was my first time, but Stacy, you have been there before, and Donnell, it was your first time as well. So Stacy, any overall observations you want to share?
Yes, there were way more people there than I've seen before. And I think that's a good sign because that means more people are being drawn to the science of reading and conferences addressing that. I also noted that there were more educators from Louisiana there, it seems like, than in the past. And that I think is great for the state of Louisiana. It seemed very practitioner-based compared to in the past. I mean, it's always had very useful things for practitioners, but it was more in the past, a little bit more like the experts talking about what they're working on, maybe.
So there was a record number of attendees this year. Any thoughts? Why do you think that is? Why there are so many more?
So I've never been before, but I can say that there's a lot of action happening with states these days about reading and the science of reading. And so to me, that's what I could see just in conversations that I overheard, in some of the presentations that were given, that was mentioned. And to me, that seemed to be, again, I'm new to the conference. I don't know everything, but just picking that up, being at the conference, it's because of the traction that the science of reading is getting and legislation that's happening too. We've discussed that here on this podcast before. Those are two key pieces, I think, that are now leading to folks being more interested in going to conferences and getting information to take back and disseminate. And like Stacy said, I thought it was interesting because I've heard Stacy talk about this conference. I was excited to attend. In the past, it did sound more researcher based. So I kind of went with that in mind, but this was definitely more for the practitioner and coaches, a lot of coaches too. And Stacy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that was my supposition, and I've only been to two other of these conferences, so I wasn't 100% that was accurate. But I will say the first session that I attended was Julie Washington's, and she started out by saying, normally at conferences I talk about what I know, but today I'm going to talk about what I wonder. And I got so excited by that, by the way. But she said, and I think this is the place for that, because I'm going to talk to you about what I wonder. And then at the end, I want to hear what you think about it. And that's not probably typical practice in a conference that's solely based for practitioners. And so I thought about that later and thought maybe that is a little accurate. I don't know if there are any listeners out there who can inform us on this, but those were just my thoughts.
Yeah, it was definitely... There was a lot of people there. It was crowded. I just remember there was a lot of sessions where there were not any more chairs and people were sitting on the ground. And it is like you guys mentioned, it's an exciting problem to have that there's so many people there. I still think the majority of people there were, literacy coaches. I know we were sitting in sessions where they'd have you raise your hand, and there still were not a lot of teachers there. Why do you guys think that is? Why don't districts send more teachers?
I have some thoughts on this. So I got back and I got to thinking about all the coaches that had been at the conference. And I have to admit that I said to my husband, who was asking me, how did it go? What'd you like? He always loves to hear about the conference. And one of the things he did say to me is, so what do you think about that there were more coaches than teachers? And I said, I don't know. It's almost like we're adding yet another layer between the teacher and the information. And now we got this thing called coach in between. And why are we just so reluctant to find a way to get the teachers to the conferences directly to the information? It's just kind of interesting to me. And I don't know, maybe it's the nature of this particular conference, but I see it in my own state too. And I don't know, anybody else have some thoughts? I'd love to hear them.
I was thinking about this. In fact, just today, I was telling a teacher who was asking me how the conference was. And I do think it was fantastic. I love that there were so many people there, no matter their role, because that does tell us about the hunger that people have to learn about the science of reading. And that is great. I feel like it would be awesome if we could provide more venues for that. But my thought was this, going along with what you were saying, Donnell. In fact, I said to this teacher, ironically, I've had better professional development since I left public school setting than I had when I was there as a literacy coach. I was a coach. And we did have better PD than the teachers did, for sure, because part of our job was to disseminate that information. Some of these conferences are held in the middle of the school year, and so teachers are busy teaching. We had the same issue we talked about with legislation. And that time of year, teachers can't be involved in that because they're in the classroom. Right now, there are shortages. That might have factored into it. I just think there's a lot to consider there. I wish we had more opportunities. We have great conferences like the IDA conference and the Reading League conference, but it seems like we might need more.
And none of them are in the summer, right? And it would be wonderful to have some more in the summer, because writing subplans is a pain and it takes me forever. And I had to write, a whole bunch of subplans last week. And I usually do almost anything I can to avoid writing subplans and being gone. It was worth it, but I had the opportunity to go, and that's not very normal, I think. And I've sat in presentations before where the information is maybe trickling through a presenter that maybe is not even as knowledgeable, and I have found myself being like, I want to go right to the source a lot of times and hear that for myself. And I just think the whole PD thing in general, it can be frustrating because usually teachers, we just have to sit through whatever someone chooses to tell us and teach us about. I like going to a conference because then I can choose my track and I can choose what I think I need to learn, Yeah,
I think there at conferences too, there's something else to be said about networking, but just getting to know other educators. If you're there in the same room with them, it's a lot easier than randomly chatting somebody up on a Zoom meeting.
Okay, so that leads me to something I was going to ask Donnell about. Because Donnell, you were talking about how there are so many different ways to learn at conferences. And I just was wondering if you wanted to elaborate and kind of share some of those benefits that you see.
At the conferences, one thing I did want to mention too, that it tags on to this, I've been involved in putting together reading conferences in my state. And we did do a survey for teachers about if we held the conference this time of year, gave them choices. And interestingly enough, they didn't want one in the summer. Overwhelmingly, the reason was they had vacations. It was their downtime and they didn't want to give that up and try to plan their summer around. So that was just something to think about. I hadn't thought of that before. Then I also thought, you know what, you're a professional and we should find a way while you're in your profession to provide that to you, a quality conference. That's true too. So I don't know, I have thoughts on that. But additionally at the conference, the way you get the information, there's a couple of things going on at the conference that I think are really valuable. And like you say, Lindsay, one is choosing your own track rather than someone coming back to you and saying, here's what I thought was really important from the conference. And I'm going to tell you what I took away. There's a whole lot that can be lost in translation, depending on my experience. The other piece is Stacy and I sat in on a few where we are very familiar with the presenter. This might be the fourth, fifth, maybe even sixth, seventh, or eighth time I've heard this particular presenter, few that I had seen that many times. And the information, the topic wasn't even very different from what I've heard before. And I've read maybe the 2 or 3 books or 4 this individual has written. So, that's a lot of information about this person. And I still walk away with new insights things just come together for me. I'm making connections, and there's a lot of value to that. So I also caution people who look at a conference and say, oh, I've heard that person present. If they're really good and they've done a lot of research, you can get so much value out of hearing that person again.
That's what I love about the depth of the science that goes into reading development and teaching reading. Because I will tell you, I'm thinking of a conference that I attended as a literacy coach. I guess it's okay to say names. It was Fountas and Pinnell themselves. And I went there thinking just what you said, Donnell. Yes, this was back in the height of when I was doing all the things with balanced literacy and expecting and hoping to learn from them. And I didn't. Beyond that, there was a group of educators there who were angry about that. And they went right up to them and said, we've read your books. You said nothing new. There wasn't anything else to say. But I loved going to David Kilpatrick's session and Stanislaus Dehaene, which I gain insight. I understand things better every time. And there's so much more I could learn.
Yeah, I love that. We're going to get into our favorite sessions in just a minute. But another thing we were talking about is that another benefit of the conferences is just networking with others. And it was so fun to connect with people. Some of them I had only, ever talked to or spoken to or interacted with online. So it was just so fun to see people in person. And I had the opportunity to have lunch with Nora Chabazi, who I would consider her a friend, even though this is the first time we'd ever spoken with or seen each other. We've spoken and done Zoom calls and different things. And then David Chalk, and he is this entrepreneur, millionaire from Canada. And it was so fascinating to hear his story and just have this private conversation with him where he shared his story of his struggles with dyslexia, and he just learned to read last year. So it was so interesting. He said something because he had all this anxiety and pain, and then he learned to read, and he told me, reading solves my pain. And I just love that. And it's just little moments like that. You can't always we could sit through the presentations and they're amazing, but it's sometimes just those other little moments, or just sitting next to another teacher that you meet from somewhere and talking to them. There's just so many things I love about in-person conferences in general. And it's been a while since we've had them, thanks to COVID and everything.
So I was going to mention, Lindsay, that was interesting, you talking about networking, because I found that challenging because we were all masked. And so I may very well have walked by somebody I knew and not known it because we were all masked up. And the other thing is that I felt I didn't hesitate. I didn't want to take down or get too close. I didn't know how people were feeling because we're all kind of venturing back into this shared space kind of tentatively. So I thought that was interesting too. But along those lines of what you take away from the conference are important things. And we'll get into, I guess, talking about some of the sessions we went to. I already this week, we've only been back a short number of days. It has informed and changed my practice with all of my students. So I've had an opportunity to teach at least one round with all of my students since returning, and my practice is different because of what I picked up from this conference. So that's another thing that I think is sometimes pushback we get is, okay, so you went, you enjoyed, you loved it, you took notes, you love talking about it. What difference does it make on the ground, really? And I have to say, a big difference. And it just informed my practice this week. And my poor husband's exhausted because he has dyslexia. And so I love to bring back what I learned and ask him to do a few activities with me. But I think even by Tuesday, Wednesday, I'd been home for a few days. Even he said, wow, you really did gain a lot from this conference. So I think that's interesting too.
Well, Donnell, you're faster than me because I went to several sessions on vocabulary. That's just an area I want to improve. So there's this fabulous teacher, Ms. Usen Teaches is like her handle or her name. She shared all these great strategies about teaching vocabulary. And then I went to Jennifer Hasser and she taught all these great things. And I went to Deb Glazer and she talked about morphology and vocabulary. And then we got home late Friday night. I enjoyed my weekend. On Monday, I had no prep time on Monday. I get in front of my class and I'm like, what was I supposed to do again? And I just go into my normal routine of introducing our vocabulary words. And I'm like, dang it. But it took a little bit. But today, by golly, I added some things. We did these little vocabulary skits that, we had learned about in different things. And it just took me a little bit of time.
Yeah, I totally get that. I actually attended Laura Stewart's handwriting session and it was fantastic. And speaking of networking, I did get to meet her. She is as delightful as she sounds, but she changed my practice already. And I'm in a different setting. I'm a university professor, but one of my foundations of reading classes were right at the alphabetic principal stage. Perfect time to talk about handwriting. So I already changed the way that I teach that to my students. So to Donnell's point, that is really great. And Lindsay, I did lose some sleep in order to be able to do that well. I get it.
I just need a little bit more time. Yes, a little more prep time and then I'm good.
Conferences offer a valuable opportunity to learn new ideas, connect with colleagues, and take time to reflect on your own professional growth. Each Literacy Talks podcast episode is a convenient way to stay current with all the great new things happening in literacy learning. Get the latest insights and tips from the Literacy Talks podcast team. Sign up today for our newsletter by visiting readinghorizons.com/literacytalks.
Okay, well, let's just share maybe some favorite sessions, any key takeaways you had. Donnell, let's start with you.
Oh, Stanislaus Dehaene for me. I mean, he's always, it's like seeing your favorite rock band or something. He never disappoints. And he dropped a lot of great stuff. He went, he clarified a lot of things, had some great moments there. But he mentioned just in passing that he hosts a conference himself in Paris of individuals who are doing research on the brain and the brain reading, the reading brain. And one of the researchers, he just dropped into his presentation, lightly touched on it and talked about that we don't talk about, at least he doesn't anymore, dyslexia, singular. He talks about dyslexias with an S and named 19 types so far that have been identified by some of these researchers. Well, that was just enough for me because really interested and fascinated because obviously dyslexia is a point for me in my work. Came home, started doing a deep dive research, and there's a lot of really good information. And it's good for me to have an opportunity like that because in my day-to-day and the individuals in my community here, we're not really talking about these things. I'm not going to find it here. But having gone to the conference, I'm able to access this information. And then because we live in the information age, I can now access more information online and that sort of thing and start making connections and networking to get additional information. That's something you couldn't do before. So again, the conferences themselves may provide that little spark, the avenue, the touch that you need. And then in the information age, you can continue on with it. I think that's something more that we get from conferences in this day and age too.
Yeah, I loved Stanislaus Dehaene as well. And one thing that he said that stuck out to me, and I had to go and tweet it afterwards, because he said, according to researchers, there are no reading wars. We know how reading works. And that kind of follows up, too, with what we were talking about last week in our podcast.
That was Stanislaus too, for me, listening to his presentation, which I've heard much of what he said before, but the man is so brilliant. I had insight this time to how reversals and why reversals happen when kids are writing and reading and why they confuse them. I've known about that generally as a practitioner before, but this time I understood what's happening in the brain. He extensively explained the visual system and how our brain slowly develops. And then it was kind of cool to just sort of meld all that information together and recognize the importance of letter formation in making sure the brain recognizes those letters in the accurate way. Also, maybe a good time to mention that Reading Horizons actually sponsored Stanislaus Dehaene. So that was kind of fun too. Wish he could have been here in person. It was good to hear him either way.
I really enjoyed a presentation by David Kilpatrick. And he talked about critical thinking versus political thinking. And he talked about how political thinking, your goal is to persuade others. Whereas critical thinking, the goal is to find out what is actually true. It's so easy to slip into political thinking, but where we should be is really at the critical thinking level. And he said that humility is a central tenet of that.
I just want to add to that. A, that sounds a little bit like Adam Grant, don't you think, Donnell? B, this is the thing, the presenters that I feel like I got the most out started their talks not asserting themselves as experts, but more as learners. And that goes back to, I think we talked about it in the last episode, maybe the last one, we talked about the importance of humility in learning and teaching. And I thought that was really true. David Kilpatrick, I feel like, just exemplifies that no matter what. So he is a good role model, but it really helped me want to work on that myself.
Okay. Any other key takeaways, favorite sessions? Donnell.
So Tim Odegaard. So he's out of Tennessee, and a lot of folks may be familiar with him, and he runs a literacy center there too. This was the first time I heard him talk personally about having dyslexia. I've never heard him speak about it himself. And that was really compelling. He's a professor, he's a PhD. But his story was really interesting because, and I won't get into all the details because it's a really good story. And if he ever tells it again, I might record it. But he talks about the fact that when he was young and clearly struggling with reading, that his mother asks for help from the school, and they do the testing for special education, and come back to his mother and they say, oh, Tim doesn't qualify for services because there just isn't enough discrepancy because he's just not smart enough. And so there's not enough discrepancy between how poorly he's performing in reading and his intelligence. And thankfully, he said, my mom didn't tell me any of that until he was much older when he got his PhD that his mother shared with him. Oh, by the way, that was really, I thought, a great story, but also it speaks to, because Dr. Odegaard, what he was saying in his talk was, we really need to be careful about the assumptions that we make and always asking questions about why we're doing what we're doing and how it's going to help the student. And he said, we need to stop having blinders on and getting stuck in that way of doing things, systems, and really think about the student. And that really, that is how I like to do my work, but I love the reminder that every time I'm with a student or with a class, it's all about my learners. And that's how it needs to be. So I thought that was great.
It kind of reminds me of Sean Robinson gave it wasn't a keynote, but in his session where he was sharing his nickname is Dr. Dyslexia Dude. He's written some stories and he just shared his experience growing up in that system. And just, he said, don't let test scores predict your future, because over and over, he was just failing. And his teachers told him, you can graduate from high school, maybe you'll get a job at McDonald's, but there's nothing really, else out there for you. And he just persevered. He got his bachelor's degree, and even still, they were saying, okay, you're done. But he went and got his master's, then he went and got his doctorate. And I just loved some of his little quotes where he says, test scores can't predict a student's drive. They didn't know my drive. Just some great messaging. I loved it. Stacy, do you have another favorite session?
I think I liked every session I went to mostly. Pam Kastner's session was fantastic. She positioned herself as a learner by saying, 10 years ago, I would have told you my name was Pam Decodable Text Kastner because that's what I was fascinated with. Now my name is Pam spelling Kastner. So she really demonstrated that well. She had a lot of great things to say about spelling. Nancy Hennessy gave a great presentation. She flat out said, I'm a learner, I'm not an expert. But the way that she talked about syntax made me feel like I can do this. I've got this. It's very actionable and sensible. Also, Stephanie Stoller, who I did get to meet in person for the first time, and I appreciated that she was there. I feel like nobody asked if there were college professors in the room. So I'm not sure how many of us there were at the conference, but I know her through my association as a professor. And so first time I met her in person, she's great. But I really appreciated her session on MTSS. And I found myself frustrated, not with anything she said by any means, but the fact that we have been implementing MTSS has been around for over 20 years. Well, about 20 years, right? We're still getting to the point of implementing it. And that kind of frustrated me. But one thing she said that was insightful, and I was lucky enough to be in a school in a district where we fully embraced it, and we got to make a lot of great decisions based on that model. And I had a lot of really valuable experience doing that. One thing she said that would be such a time saver for anybody who is implementing MTSS is to have meetings around groups of students, just individual students, And at first, that provided a little cognitive dissonance for me because we had meetings for individual students. And as teacher, we're focused on individual students. But then I realized, oh, no, we've got groups of kids with similar profiles or who have similar needs. Why not meet about a group of students? And then we can meet all of their needs individually. Anyway, I'm excited to direct people to do that.
I loved her session too. I was in there. Just listen to her title. It was Weighing the Hog Doesn't Make It Fatter. And, she's talking about assessments here. And it's just so true. We can test and test and test. But if you don't do anything with that data, then there's really no point to the testing. And so that was a great session. Donnell, anything else?
I've got to do a shout out for some of the sessions that were involved in this conference that at first I was wondering, with everything that we need to learn about the science of reading, I don't know about taking up some sessions with this. And it was about inclusivity. And I wondered how they were going to put that together with the session. And it ended up being fantastic. And in fact, a couple of those sessions, I came away thinking those were really valuable. And I'm still thinking about them. And one was by a woman named Jeanette Washington. And a lot of her work is on social media with equity. And when she started talking, she had these ideas about how you can be more inclusive. And one of the activities involved social media and posting and that sort of thing. And I noticed some folks kind of glazed over a little bit. But the further she got into her presentation, I really appreciated the messages that she was sending. And they all had to do with just opening up wider the types of stories and narratives that we include when we are teaching our students to learn to read, and that we can do a lot of work in helping students to be kinder to each other, more accepting of each other, to think more about other communities that might be different from your own, all within reading. And I just really started to see the potential of not just the work that I'm doing on the decoding and encoding and all those pieces that I do with the science of reading, but also how that expands the mind. It kind of just brought it full circle for me. So I really appreciated those sessions.
My favorite, if I had to choose a favorite, which would be hard, but it would be Julie Washington's session. And going along with what you're saying, Donnell, she was talking about equity without talking about equity. She was talking about dialect and the role that plays in learning to read. I just got a sense as I listened to her talk, how powerful that would be for all of us as educators to understand that fully, and how much more equitable reading instruction would be if we just understood that one thing. And I know there's many more facets and many more things that we need to understand in order to have an equitable educational experience for all kids. But I felt like that would move the dial a lot, because we would help those students who have dialect differences in dialect from our own as teachers. We can understand it and know how to meet their needs.
Thank you for sharing all those. A lot of important takeaways. We loved the conference, but how would you guys make it better? What would you change, or what suggestions do you have for conferences in the future?
I appreciate that the venue has been the same for a long time. I feel like it was very crowded for how many participants there were. So I might start with that. I think the three of us, we had those discussions about maybe having different strands like they've done at other conferences.
Yeah, strands. Like we were talking about, here's a strand for teachers, here's a strand for coaches, here's ones for administrators. So you could just get, a little more tailored to what you need.
The other thing I think that would be an improvement is during one session, you've got like 7 or 8 choices, and there might be 3 that you really wanted to attend. I think I would pare those down and I would have them color coded. So if it say involved spelling, you saw that spelling color code show up at different times. So if I didn't get it here, I could choose it here. And then when I put my schedule together, I might be able to stagger it and get all of those sessions in. So I wouldn't offer so many sessions. I'd pare down the sessions and then have the topics and repeat those sessions so that people would be able to do more than one of a session that they wanted. Because I felt like I missed out on some stuff.
Sometimes there was like 4 I wanted to go to all at the same time. This was a great conversation, you guys. Oh, I can't wait till the next conference.
I was just going to say, I do like going to another place outside of the place where I live, because you get to see another community and how they react. I think the way that the individuals reacted to the presenters, it was very vocal. It was very enthusiastic. I love that where I'm from. You don't typically see that. It was fantastic to be a part of it. I loved the energy. I love Southern hospitality. So that was really nice. I know that we can't always travel, but that really adds something to the instruction, is to also see the participants in that community and how they react to the information, which was really fun too.
And Lindsay and Donnell got to see Bourbon Street for the first time and have a beignet.
That's right. We had a beignet. I had the best gumbo I've ever had. All right. Well, I'm excited for our next conference. I'm just glad to be in person again. It's been too long. So anyway, thank you for this discussion, you guys. This was great.
Thank you, Lindsay. It was a great topic. Next fall, we have a lot of other conferences to look forward to. So the Reading League will probably be in person, right? IDA. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. In the meantime, you will hear us next session of Literacy Talk. So thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for joining us today for Literacy Talks, the podcast series for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Join us next time.